There is a kind of silence that only exists in the moments right before everything falls apart. Not the comfortable silence of an empty morning, not the peaceful silence of a sleeping house. This is the other kind, the held breath kind. The kind where the air itself seems to understand that something is about to happen that cannot be undone. That silence filled a grand ballroom in Atlanta, Georgia, on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. 400 guests sat in white-draped chairs. Oh, an orchestra played softly at the far end of the room. The chandeliers caught the afternoon light and scattered it across the walls in patterns that looked almost like diamonds. Everything was perfect. Everything was planned. And then, outside the main entrance of the Grand Terrace Ballroom, a black limousine pulled up to the curb. And the silence inside that room got louder. She had every reason not to show up. She had been told, in quiet but very clear terms, that showing up would be a mistake, that it would make her look desperate, unstable, bitter. She had heard those words before. They had followed her around for 2 years, like a shadow she could not outrun. Desperate, unstable, bitter. She had built her entire rebirth on proving that none of them were true. And yet, here she was, standing at the door of a limousine, her hand on the frame, her crimson gown catching the wind, and staring at the entrance of a building that was about to become the place where 5 years of carefully constructed lies finally cracked open at the seams. Her name was Naomi Carter, and the man getting married inside that building had spent the last 2 years of his life making sure that no one in Atlanta would believe a single word she said. His name was Marcus Holloway, and today was the day his story ran out of road. And before we go any further, before we get into what happened inside that ballroom, what was inside that limo, what was written on that document that would change everything, I want you to understand something. This is not a story about revenge. This is not a story about a woman who could not let go. This is a story about what happens when a man decides that another person's contribution to his success is inconvenient. What happens when the system that was supposed to protect her failed her. No, and what happens when a woman who was told she had nothing finds out that she actually had everything, and that someone had been hiding it from her all along. This is the story of Marcus Holloway, Naomi Carter, and the lie he built his life on. And we are just getting started. Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one come out regularly, and you do not want to be late to a single one of them. Let me lay out the central questions of this story right now, because they are going to stay with you. Why did Marcus Holloway invite his ex-partner to his own wedding? Of all the things a man planning his second marriage could do in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, why would he take the time to send a personal invitation to the one woman whose name he had spent 2 years dragging through the mud? Was it arrogance? Was it a final act of power? The kind that says, "Look at what I have. Look at what you lost"? Or was it the kind of mistake that only very confident people make? The kind where you are so sure you have won that you invite your opponent to watch the trophy ceremony. And then, the second question. What was in the envelope that Naomi Carter placed on the guest book table before she turned and walked back out of that ballroom? Because whatever was in that envelope, Marcus Holloway did not open it for 3 days. 3 days. A man who returned calls within the hour, who ran a real estate firm of 47 employees, who had built an empire on the principle of never letting anything sit unresolved. That man let an envelope sit on his kitchen counter for 72 hours without opening it? That tells you something. That tells you he already knew what was inside. And he was afraid of what happened the moment it became real. The third question is the one that matters most. Who was Richard Caldwell? And why did one of the most powerful business figures in the Southeast walk into that ballroom on Naomi Carter's arm? Because Richard Caldwell did not go anywhere without a reason. He was 61 years old, the founder of Caldwell Capital Group, a man whose firm had restructured 3 failing hospital systems, 2 regional banks, and a telecommunications company that most people had already written off as dead. He did not show up at a wedding for sentiment. And he did not show up for the food. He showed up because he had read something that had been buried for years, and that something had a number attached to it, a very large number. Keep those 3 questions in mind, because by the time this story is over, every single one of them will be answered. And the answers are going to be harder to sit with than the questions. To understand how this story ends, you have to understand how it began. And it began the way so many American stories begin, with a young man who grew up watching his family struggle and made himself a promise. Marcus Holloway was born in 1981 in a modest house on the west side of Atlanta to a mother who worked as a medical billing clerk and a father who worked construction when the work was there and drank when it was not. He was the middle child of 3, and from an early age he showed a talent for observation. And he watched the way money moved through his neighborhood. He watched who had it, who did not, and more importantly, who pretended. By the time he was 16, Marcus Holloway had decided that he was going to be one of the people who had it. Not the kind who pretended, the real kind. He got a partial scholarship to Georgia State, majored in business administration, and spent his first 2 years after graduation working for a mid-sized property management company in Buckhead, by learning every corner of the real estate industry from the inside. He was sharp. He was tireless. His former colleagues have described him as someone who never left the office before 9 at night and was back in by 7 the next morning. He wanted it badly. And that kind of hunger, when it is disciplined and directed, can do extraordinary things. The problem, as this story will show, is that hunger does not always teach you how to be honest about what you owe to the people who fed you along the way. Naomi Carter grew up in Decatur, a suburb just east of Atlanta. Her mother was a registered nurse who worked overnight shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital. Her father had passed away when Naomi was 9, a heart attack at 43 that her mother never fully recovered from, emotionally or financially. Naomi watched her mother hold that family together with 2 hands and a determination that most people would not have been able to sustain for a week, let alone a decade. And that early education, watching a woman rebuild a life with limited resources and unlimited resolve, shaped Naomi in ways that would become important later in this story. She was methodical. She was patient. And she had an instinct for documentation that most people only develop after they have been burned. She met Marcus in 2013 at a professional networking event in Midtown Atlanta. She was 29. He was 32. She was working as an LPN at a rehabilitation center while finishing her registered nursing degree at night. He was 2 years into striking out on his own after leaving the property management firm, working out of a rented desk at a co-working space and hustling for every listing he could get. What struck people who knew them both back then was how equal they seemed, not just in ambition, but in struggle. They were both building something from scratch. They were both starting from behind, and they recognized that in each other almost immediately. By 2015, they were together. By 2016, they were living together in a rented duplex in East Atlanta. And by early 2017, something else had happened. something that would become the central financial fact of this entire story, and the thing that Marcus Holloway would spend the next several years trying to make disappear. In February 2017, Naomi Carter co-signed a business loan with Marcus Holloway for $340,000. It was the seed capital for what would become Holloway Development Group. The loan required two signatories because Marcus's credit history, while improving, was not yet strong enough to carry the full liability alone. Naomi's credit was clean. On her signature was the reason the bank said yes. And that signature, and what it represented, is the thing that sits at the center of everything that follows. In early 2018, Holloway Development Group acquired its first significant property, a former commercial building near the Atlanta Beltline that Marcus had identified as an undervalued asset in a neighborhood that was about to change rapidly. He was right. He had an eye for that kind of thing. The building was purchased for $1.2 million, renovated over 18 months, and sold in late 2019 for $2.8 million. That first deal made Marcus Holloway a name in Atlanta real estate circles. It also funded the acquisition of what would eventually become the Meridian Complex, a mixed-use development on the south side of the city that would generate more than $4 million in revenue in its first 2 operating years. And on the original shareholder agreement for that project, filed in October of 2019 and notarized by a Fulton County public notary, there were 2 names, Marcus Holloway and Naomi Carter, with a split of 60% and 40%, respectively. It is important that you hear that clearly. 40%. Of $4 million. That is $1.6 million that Naomi Carter was contractually owed. $1.6 million that she never received. Not 1 cent. And because by the time the Meridian Complex began generating revenue, Marcus and Naomi were no longer together. And by the time the money started coming in, her name had been quietly removed from the operational documents and buried beneath the paperwork of 2 newly formed shell companies, neither of which carried her signature, and neither of which she had ever been told existed. What Marcus Holloway had done was not unusual in its mechanics. The tactics he used, the shell company layering, and the retroactive restructuring of ownership documents, the strategic exclusion of a former partner from the financial upside of a jointly originated deal. These are things that happen in business. They are things that unethical actors do when they believe they will never be caught. What made Marcus's case remarkable was not what he did. It was how thoroughly he had prepared the narrative to make sure no one would believe her if she ever tried to talk about it. And because Marcus did not just erase Naomi Carter from the financial record, he erased her from the public story of who he was. In the interviews he began giving to Atlanta business publications between 2019 and 2021, he described himself consistently as a self-made entrepreneur who had bootstrapped his way to success from nothing. In one profile piece he said, and these are the words that Naomi Carter would later describe as the ones that stung the most, he said, "I had no safety net, no investors, just my own belief and my own work ethic. No safety net." Those words sat on a printed page in a framed magazine profile in the lobby of his office building. And Naomi Carter, the woman who had co-signed his first loan, who had worked overnight nursing shifts to pay her half of their shared rent while he was building that company, and who had signed her name on the shareholder agreement that gave that company its most profitable asset. She was supposed to read those words and stay quiet. For a long time, she did. Marcus ended the relationship in the fall of 2021. They had been together for 6 years. He did it in a way that Naomi has since described as clinical, not cruel in a dramatic sense, not a screaming argument or a thrown plate. Just a conversation at their kitchen table, in which he told her that he had grown in a direction that she could not follow, that they wanted different things, that he wished her well. And 3 weeks later, he introduced a woman named Diane Whitfield to his inner circle. Diane was 34, a marketing executive, polished and composed in all the ways that were useful to a man building a certain kind of public image. She had the right contacts, and the right poise, and the right understanding of how to stand beside an ambitious man without ever making him feel like she needed anything back. Marcus Holloway had not simply moved on. He had upgraded his public profile. And Naomi Carter, with her nursing scrubs and her quiet competence and her signed documents in a file folder she had been smart enough to keep, was now an inconvenience. What happened next is the part of this story that is hardest to talk about, because it is the part that is most common. What Marcus did to Naomi's reputation after their breakup did not involve a single dramatic lie. It involved dozens of small ones, delivered quietly and consistently to the people who mattered in Atlanta's business community. He told mutual contacts that Naomi had become emotionally unstable in the final years of their relationship. He implied to his associates that she had been a financial burden, that he had carried her, rather than the other way around. He told at least 2 people in his professional network that she had struggled with alcohol, which was not true, and which she would not find out he had said until a year later when a former colleague mentioned it to her in passing, almost apologetically, as if Naomi should already know that this story was out there circulating under her name. He made sure that anyone who might take her seriously would have a reason to hesitate. The end, because he delivered these things with the measured, regretful tone of a man reluctantly sharing difficult information rather than the defensive energy of a man protecting a lie, most people believed him. There is a well-documented pattern in financial fraud cases, particularly those involving partners who were romantically involved, where the person who commits the fraud also engages in what researchers have called reputation laundering. And the goal is not necessarily to destroy the other person publicly. It is simply to make them less credible, to ensure that if they ever do speak up, there is already a story in place that explains why their account should not be taken at face value. Unstable, bitter, difficult. These are words that follow certain women into rooms before they even arrive. Marcus understood this intuitively, and he used it with a precision that, in retrospect, was breathtaking. Naomi Carter spent most of 2022 in a kind of fog that she has since described as grief with no obvious name. She had not simply lost a relationship. She had lost the professional context in which she had operated for 6 years. The community of people who might have been her advocates had already been quietly briefed. She could not walk into a room in Atlanta's business world without wondering what version of herself had arrived there before her. She focused on her nursing work, and she picked up extra shifts. She moved into a smaller apartment closer to the hospital, and she started going through old files, not obsessively, just quietly, the way people do when something in the back of their mind will not let them rest. She found the shareholder agreement in March of 2022. It was in a manila folder in a storage box she had packed when she moved out of the apartment she had shared with Marcus. She had not even remembered that she had a copy. And when she found it and read it again, when she saw her name next to his, when she saw the 40% notation, when she calculated what 40% of the Meridian Complex's known revenue represented, she sat on the floor of her apartment for a very long time. And then she made 2 phone calls. The first was to a forensic accountant named Patricia Osei, who had been recommended by a colleague at the hospital. The second was to an attorney named Bridget Monroe, who specialized in contract fraud in business partnerships. Those two phone calls would set in motion a chain of events that would end a year and 2 months later, with a black limousine pulling up to the Grand Terrace Ballroom in Atlanta, Georgia, on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. Patricia Osei spent 11 weeks reviewing every financial document that Naomi Carter could produce and cross-referencing them with public business filings available through Georgia's Secretary of State database. What she found was not simple. It was layered. It was methodical. And it told a story that was clearly the work of someone who had planned this for a long time, possibly before the relationship had even ended. See, the original business loan from 2017 had been refinanced in 2020 under a newly formed entity called HG Properties, LLC. The refinancing documents listed Marcus Holloway as the sole owner. Naomi Carter's name did not appear. The original co-signer had been, on paper, erased. The shareholder agreement for the Meridian Complex project, the one that named Naomi with a 40% stake, had been superseded in August of 2019 by a revised agreement filed under one of the shell companies, that reassigned her share to a holding entity. That holding entity's sole beneficial owner was Marcus Holloway. Naomi had not signed the revised agreement. She had not been informed of it. Her 40% had been transferred without her knowledge or consent. Technically, under Georgia contract law, that transfer was invalid. But it had been executed cleanly enough that catching it required exactly the kind of meticulous forensic work that most people in Naomi's position could not afford and did not know to pursue. Patricia Osei's final report ran to 43 pages. It documented the original loan, the shareholder agreement, the unauthorized revision, and the revenue generated by the Meridian Complex through its first 2 operating years. The report concluded that Naomi Carter had a legitimate contractual claim of not less than $1,400,000 and potentially as much as $1.8 million when interest and management fees were factored in. Patricia handed that report to Bridget Monroe. And Bridget Monroe, who had been practicing contract law in Atlanta for 22 years and had seen a great many things, said she had rarely encountered a case where the documentation trail was this clean on both sides, where the fraud was this well executed and, at the same time, this completely unambiguous once you knew where to look. Bridget Monroe's first piece of advice to Naomi was straightforward. File. Take Marcus Holloway to court. Let the documentation speak, and let the legal process work. Naomi heard her out, and then she asked a different question. She said, "What happens if we do not file in court? What are the other options?" Bridget Monroe looked at her for a long moment, and then she started talking about a different kind of resolution. One that involved disclosure rather than litigation. One that relied not on a judge seeing the documents, but on the right person seeing the documents at the right moment. Naomi Carter was not interested in a legal settlement that would be sealed and kept quiet. She was not interested in a check that came with a non-disclosure agreement attached. She had watched Marcus Holloway spend 2 years reshaping reality. She wanted the record corrected. Not in a courtroom where the details would be buried in case files, in a way that the people who had believed his version of events could not ignore. It was Bridget Monroe who made the introduction to Richard Caldwell, and she had worked with his firm on 2 previous matters and knew that Caldwell Capital had recently been approached about a potential acquisition involving one of Marcus Holloway's properties, a deal that would require an independent audit of Holloway Development Group's financials. When Bridget shared the details of Naomi's case with Richard Caldwell's legal team, the response was swift. Caldwell Capital paused the acquisition discussions immediately. And Richard Caldwell agreed to a meeting with Naomi Carter, which took place in a glass-walled conference room in his firm's Buckhead offices on a Thursday morning in February of 2023. Naomi has since said that she walked into that meeting terrified. She walked out of it with a plan. Marcus sent the wedding invitation to Naomi Carter in April of 2023. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of May. The invitation was embossed on ivory cardstock with gold lettering and a tissue paper liner, and it was addressed to her by name. And according to everyone who has since been asked about it, it was absolutely intentional. People who knew Marcus well have offered different theories for why he did it. Some believed it was calculated, a message designed to demonstrate his total indifference to her, to show that he had so thoroughly moved past their relationship that he could invite her to watch him marry someone else without a second thought. While others believed it was arrogance in its purest form, the kind that comes with a certain kind of success, the belief that you have rewritten your story so completely that the people who know the original draft can no longer threaten you. And there is a third theory, offered by someone who worked closely with Marcus during that period and preferred not to be identified, that Marcus sent the invitation as a test. That somewhere, beneath the confidence, he knew what Naomi had potentially found, and he wanted to see if she would show up. Because if she did, it meant she was ready to move. And if she was ready to move, he needed to know. What Marcus did not know, could not have known, was that Naomi had received word of the invitation 10 days before it arrived in her mailbox. Bridget Monroe had a contact inside the office that handled Marcus's personal correspondence. When that contact mentioned that an invitation had been prepared for Naomi Carter, Bridget Monroe called her client immediately. And Naomi Carter, who had been quietly preparing for this moment for 14 months, sat with the information for 24 hours. And then she called Richard Caldwell, and she said, "I think it is time." The plan was not complicated. It did not need to be. Naomi would accept the invitation. She would attend the wedding. She would bring one document, a certified copy of the original 2019 shareholder agreement, with the relevant clauses highlighted and the revenue figures annotated in the margins in Bridget Monroe's handwriting. She would place that document in a sealed envelope on the guest book table. She would do nothing else. She would not make a scene. She would not confront Marcus at the altar. She would not speak to Diane Whitfield. She would simply appear in a way that demonstrated that she was no longer hiding, that she was no longer ashamed, and that the era in which Marcus Holloway could define who she was had come to an end. And she would bring Richard Caldwell because his presence in that room sent a message that no speech ever could. It said, "She is not alone. She is not powerless. And whoever she is standing with has enough resources to make this very, very complicated for you." Richard Caldwell agreed without hesitation. He has since said, in a statement his firm released several months after the events of that day, that his decision to attend was both professional and personal. Professional because his firm's audit of Holloway Development Group had already revealed irregularities that warranted serious attention. Personal because, in his own words, he had seen too many women with legitimate claims dismissed because they appeared to be standing alone. He was not willing to let that happen again. The morning of the wedding was warm and clear. Atlanta in late May has a particular quality of light, golden and slightly heavy with humidity, the kind that makes everything look more vivid than usual, like a photograph taken with the best possible lens. The grand terrace ballroom had been dressed entirely in ivory and gold. There were fresh gardenias on every surface. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 2 in the afternoon. By 1:30, all 400 guests were seated. Marcus Holloway was at the altar. He'd wearing a charcoal suit with a white pocket square, looking exactly like the man he had spent 15 years constructing, assured, composed, and completely in control. Diane Whitfield was in the bridal suite, her mother adjusting her veil, her best friend pouring a last glass of champagne. She looked beautiful. She was, by every account, a woman who was genuinely happy on the day of her wedding. And that fact matters, because Diane Whitfield is not a villain in this story. She is something more complicated than that. She is a woman who trusted the version of Marcus Holloway that Marcus Holloway had most carefully built. At 1:45, a black limousine pulled up to the front entrance of the Grand Terrace Ballroom. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door, and Naomi Carter stepped out onto the sidewalk in a floor-length crimson gown, her hair pinned back, her posture so still and so deliberate that several people who were standing near the entrance later said the same thing independently of each other. They said she looked like someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time and was not going to waste a single second of it by looking nervous. Richard Caldwell stepped out behind her. He was in a dark navy suit, no tie, silver cufflinks. He offered his arm. She took it. And they walked through the front doors of the Grand Terrace Ballroom together. What happened in the next 4 minutes has been described by nearly a dozen eyewitnesses, all of whom have told essentially the same story. The room did not erupt. There was no screaming. There was no dramatic confrontation. What happened was quieter than that, and somehow more devastating. Naomi and Richard Caldwell walked to the guest book table near the entrance. Naomi placed the sealed envelope on the table, next to the guest book, in plain sight. She signed the guest book. She wrote her name clearly and legibly, the way she had always done everything, without hesitation, without apology, without drama. And then she looked toward the altar. Marcus Holloway had seen her. The guests nearby had begun to notice. The murmur that started near the doors moved slowly through the room the way a wave moves through water. Not a crash, just a ripple, reaching the back of the room, then the sides, then finally the altar, where Marcus Holloway stood with an expression that one witness later described as a man watching something collapse in slow motion, knowing there is absolutely nothing he can do. Naomi Carter did not go to her assigned seat. She and Richard Caldwell stood near the entrance for exactly 4 minutes. Long enough to be seen. Long enough for the message to be received. And then they turned and walked back out the way they had come. The limousine was still at the curb, and the driver opened the door. They got in, and they left. The ceremony proceeded. The vows were exchanged. The orchestra played. The guests applauded. And on the guest book table, the envelope sat exactly where Naomi had placed it, untouched, waiting, the way certain truths always wait, for the moment when the person it was meant for finally had no choice but to pick it up. Marcus Holloway did not open the envelope that day. He did not open it the day after either. He opened it on the 3rd day, and alone in his home office at approximately 11 o'clock at night, according to his own later account. He has described the experience of reading it as seeing something he already knew, but had chosen not to know. The way you can look at a crack in a wall for years and tell yourself, it is nothing, it is fine. And then, one day, the crack is too wide to ignore, and you understand that the wall is not settling. The wall is falling. He read the highlighted clauses of the shareholder agreement, and he read the revenue annotations in Bridget Monroe's handwriting. He read the bottom line figure, $1.6 million, minimum, at the contractual rate, exclusive of interest. And then he put the document down. And according to the one person he told about this moment, he sat in the dark for a very long time, saying nothing at all. Diane Whitfield, now Diane Holloway, returned from her honeymoon in Italy 10 days after the wedding. She had not addressed the incident at the ballroom with Marcus directly during those 10 days. She had asked once, on the second day of the trip, who Naomi Carter was. Marcus had said she was a former girlfriend who had not handled the breakup well. Diane had looked at him for a moment, and then she accepted that answer. But accepting an answer is not the same as believing it. And Diane Whitfield had been a marketing executive for 11 years, which means she had spent her career evaluating whether people were telling her the truth. She was good at it. She had chosen not to use that skill in that moment, on the terrace of a hotel in Positano, with the Mediterranean spread out below them, because she did not want to know what using it would cost her. But she could not suspend it forever. When she got home, she pulled out the guest book from the wedding. She had been told that an envelope had been left on the guest book table. She found it still there, tucked under the book, where Marcus had placed it after reading it. He had not thrown it away. She has since said that the fact that he kept it told her something. A man with nothing to hide would have thrown it away. Only a man who understood its legal weight would have kept it. She opened the envelope. She read the shareholder agreement. She read the annotations. And then she did something that surprised even herself. She did not call Marcus. She called her attorney. And the attorney's name was Sandra Reeves. And when Diane described what she had found and what she understood it to mean, Sandra Reeves listened without interrupting. And when Diane finished, Sandra Reeves said 3 words. She said, "Get your records. Do not call your husband. Not wait and see. Get your records." Diane Whitfield understood exactly what that meant. She had married someone whose financial history had not been fully disclosed to her. And the question was no longer whether there was a problem. The question was how large the problem was. In the weeks that followed, Diane made a series of calls that Marcus Holloway would not find out about until later. She reached out to Naomi Carter through Bridget Monroe's office. The first call between Naomi and Diane lasted 40 minutes. Naomi has since said that she was careful in that conversation not to tell Diane what to think, or what to feel, or what to do. And she said she simply told her the facts: the loan, the shareholder agreement, the shell companies, the revenue. And she told her one more thing: that she had not come to the wedding to hurt her. That she had come because she needed to correct the record in a place where Marcus would understand that correction was no longer optional. Diane Whitfield was quiet for a long time after Naomi finished. And then she said, "I need to think." And she hung up. She called back 2 days later. At the end, she told Naomi that she had pulled Marcus's business filings herself, that she had found the names of the shell companies, that she had cross-referenced them with the revenue disclosures she was now entitled to request as his spouse, and that she had confirmed, independently, everything that Naomi's documents showed. She did not need to take Naomi's word for it. She had found the evidence herself. And she told Naomi something else. And she said that in the 18 months they had dated before the wedding, she had noticed things she had chosen not to examine. A name that came up and then stopped coming up. A document once that Marcus had slid off the kitchen table and into a drawer when she walked into the room. A reaction he had once to the phrase "original partners" that she had noticed and filed away, and never taken out again until now. She had known, in the way that some part of us always knows, and that there was a story she had not been told. She had simply hoped, the way people in love always hope, that it would not matter. It mattered. Marcus Holloway gave a public statement 11 days after the wedding. His publicist had clearly been involved. The statement was measured, slightly aggrieved in tone, and carefully worded to cast the entire incident as the action of a disturbed former girlfriend who was unable to move on. He described Naomi's appearance at the ceremony as a calculated ambush. He said the envelope contained documents that had been taken out of context. He suggested that Naomi's association with Richard Caldwell was a financially motivated arrangement that spoke to her character. He did not use her name directly. He did not need to. Everyone in Atlanta who mattered already knew exactly who he was talking about. The statement had the opposite of its intended effect. In the age of careful readers, the two things immediately stood out to the thousands of people who dissected Marcus's words online. The first was that he never denied the existence of the document. He said it had been taken out of context. He did not say it was forged. He did not say her name should not have been on it. He did not say the revenue figures were wrong. He said context. That is a very specific word. Context is the word people use when the facts are accurate, but the meaning is inconvenient. And the second thing people noticed was that he had described the contents of the envelope in some detail that required him to have read it, while simultaneously claiming it contained nothing of legal consequence. You do not read something that has no legal consequence for 3 days in your home office at 11 o'clock at night. The math did not work. And the Internet is very good at math. Richard Caldwell issued a statement 3 days after Marcus's. It was 3 sentences long, and it said that Caldwell Capital Group had commissioned an independent audit of Holloway Development Group's financial records as part of a due diligence process for a potential business transaction, that the audit had identified irregularities that the firm was in the process of reviewing, and that the firm looked forward to the audit results becoming part of the public record. That was it. No drama, no accusations, no names. Just 3 sentences that told everyone who understood how these things worked exactly what was happening. A forensic financial audit. Public record. There is a specific kind of dread that comes with those 2 phrases in combination, and it is not the theatrical dread of a confrontation. It is the quiet, cold, inescapable dread of arithmetic. The numbers would tell the story now. And numbers do not have a publicist. The Caldwell Capital audit took 4 months to complete, and it examined 6 years of Holloway Development Group's financial records, including the original loan documents, the Meridian Complex shareholder agreement, the shell company structures, the revenue distributions, and the management fee allocations. The auditors produced a report that confirmed Patricia Osei's original findings in every material respect. It found that Naomi Carter's contractual interest in the Meridian Complex had been invalidly transferred without her knowledge or consent, and it found that the revenue generated by that interest had been received exclusively by entities controlled by Marcus Holloway. And it found that the total amount owed to Naomi Carter, including the base contractual share, accumulated management fee distributions, and interest calculated from the date of the first distribution, was $1,720,000. The audit also found something that Patricia Osei had not been able to confirm without access to Marcus's full financial records. There was a second development, a smaller retail property on the east side of the city, for which Naomi Carter had provided a personal guarantee in 2018. A document she had signed as a favor at Marcus's request, which she had largely forgotten about, and which had been used as collateral for a refinancing agreement in 2020 without her knowledge. And the property had since been sold at a profit of $680,000. Naomi's name was still on the guarantee. Her name was not on the distribution. The settlement was negotiated over 3 weeks in October of 2023. Bridget Monroe has declined to discuss the specific terms publicly, stating only that her client received full and fair compensation, and that the matter had been resolved to her complete satisfaction. And what is known, because it became part of the public record through a separate disclosure process related to the Caldwell Capital audit, is that Holloway Development Group underwent a significant restructuring in the months following the settlement. 2 of the shell companies were dissolved. A third was reorganized. Marcus Holloway sold his ownership stake in the Meridian complex to a real estate investment trust in the first quarter of 2024. He retained his other properties, but the sale of the Meridian complex, the project that had made his name, the project that had been built in part on Naomi Carter's signature and her 40%, was completed quietly and quickly, in the manner of someone who needed to close a chapter rather than start one. Diane Whitfield filed for annulment in November of 2023. Not divorce, annulment. Her legal team argued successfully that the marriage had been entered into under materially false pretenses, specifically that Marcus Holloway had failed to disclose financial circumstances and legal obligations that, had they been known, would have been material to Diane's decision to marry him. The annulment was granted. Diane Whitfield has since returned to her professional work and, by all available accounts, rebuilt her life with the same competence and dignity that characterized her handling of the entire situation from the moment she first opened that envelope. Naomi Carter completed her Master of Science in Nursing in May of 2024. She was 39 years old. She walked across the stage of Georgia State University's commencement ceremony in the same city where she had spent the hardest years of her life, in the same city where her name had been pulled through a story she had not written, in the same city where she had sat on an apartment floor and held a document that proved she had been robbed of something she had helped build. And she walked across that stage without bitterness. This is not a detail that should be glossed over. Bitterness would have been understandable. Bitterness would have been, in the strictest human sense, reasonable. But Naomi Carter had understood something along the way, something that most people spend decades trying to learn, and some never do. She understood that the energy it takes to be permanently angry at someone is energy that should belong to your own future. And she had decided, sometime in those long, quiet months of 2022, that Marcus Holloway was not going to own another year of her energy. He had already taken enough. She is currently working as a nurse practitioner at a community health clinic in South Atlanta, in the same general neighborhood where she grew up watching her mother hold a family together. She has started 2 small initiatives, one that provides free financial literacy workshops for women in the healthcare field, and one that helps nursing students understand their rights in any professional partnership they enter. She has spoken publicly about the importance of keeping your own copies of every document you sign. Marcus Holloway continues to operate in Atlanta's real estate market. His firm is smaller than it was at its peak, but it is operating. He gave no interviews in the 18 months following the settlement. He appeared at a charity event in December of 2024, so the first public appearance he had made in several months. And by most accounts, he looked like a man who has had to renegotiate his understanding of who he is, which is sometimes the most useful thing that can happen to a person, and sometimes the most difficult, and often both at once. What came out through public records 8 months after the settlement was something that surprised a number of people who had followed this story closely. Marcus Holloway filed papers to establish a professional mentorship fund, seeded with $2 million for women in real estate and finance who had experienced contract fraud or professional erasure. The fund was named quietly the Washington Initiative, after the street in Decatur where Naomi Carter had grown up. There was no press release. There was no ceremony. Whether that was guilt or growth or something harder to name, is not a question this story can answer, but it is a question worth sitting with. I want to stay with this story for a few more minutes, because there are things inside it that deserve to be said plainly, without the architecture of narrative suspense around them. The first is this: what Marcus Holloway did to Naomi Carter financially was fraud. Not metaphorically. Not in the loose, everyday sense in which people say something was unfair. It was contract fraud, as defined by Georgia law, as confirmed by a certified forensic audit, as resolved through a legal settlement. That matters. Because one of the things that happened to Naomi in the years she was trying to recover, one of the things that happened to her reputation, was that her story was framed as the story of a woman who could not let go. A woman who was bitter. A woman who was exaggerating. And the reframing of financial fraud as romantic dysfunction is one of the most effective tools available to someone who wants to make sure their victim is never believed. Calling a woman bitter is much easier than explaining why her name is on a document she was never paid for. The second thing I want to say is about Diane. Because Diane Whitfield's role in this story is often reduced to that of a secondary character, the new wife who did not know. But her choices in the weeks after the wedding are the most instructive part of the entire story. She was 5 weeks into a marriage when she found out that the man she had married had been hiding a financial fraud from her and from everyone else. She had every social incentive to stay quiet. She had every emotional reason to look away. The pressure on a woman in her position to simply absorb the information, to manage it privately, to protect the image of the marriage she had just publicly celebrated, that pressure is enormous. And most people who have never been in that position do not fully understand how enormous it is. And Diane Whitfield said no to all of it. She called her attorney first. She verified the facts herself. She called Naomi. And she made a decision based on what was true rather than what was comfortable. That is not a small thing. That is one of the harder things a person can do. And the third thing, the thing that I believe matters most, and that I want you to sit with after this video ends, is about documentation. This story was recoverable because Naomi Carter had kept a piece of paper. A signed shareholder agreement in a manila folder in a storage box that she almost did not bother to pack. The entire trajectory of this story, the audit, the settlement, the annulment, the fund, all of it, begins with that piece of paper. In financial fraud cases involving former romantic partners, the most common reason that victims cannot recover what was taken from them is not that the evidence does not exist. It is that the evidence was never kept. People in relationships extend trust. They do not file copies of documents they co-sign with someone they love. They do not photograph the paperwork. They do not keep the email chains. They trust, and sometimes that trust is honored, and sometimes it is used against them. The difference between the two outcomes, more often than is comfortable to acknowledge, is a file folder. Keep your documents. Keep copies of everything you sign. Keep them somewhere that belongs only to you. This is not cynicism. This is what it looks like to know your own worth. There is one last moment from this story that I keep returning to. It is not the moment in the ballroom. It is not the moment Marcus Holloway finally opened the envelope. It is not the settlement or the annulment or the graduation ceremony. See, though all of those moments carry their own weight. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than any of those. It was the moment in March of 2022 when Naomi Carter found the shareholder agreement in a storage box in her apartment and sat on the floor for a very long time. I think about what she must have felt in those minutes. I think about the particular weight of finding proof that something you suspected was real. Not because the proof makes it better, but because proof has a permanence that suspicion does not. Suspicion can be argued away. You can tell yourself you are being paranoid. You can tell yourself you are still hurting and seeing things that are not there. Proof cannot be argued away. Proof is just what it is. And I think about what it took to go from that floor, from that quiet, devastating moment of knowing, to the actions she took in the 14 months that followed. The accountant, the attorney, and the 4 months of documentation. The meeting with Richard Caldwell. The decision not to take a quiet settlement. The decision to correct the record in a way that could not be dismissed. Every step of that process required her to believe that she was worth fighting for, at a time when the dominant story about who she was had been written by the person who had defrauded her. That is the part of this story that gets lost in the drama of the limousine and the ballroom and the envelope. The quiet 14 months. The work. Patience. The decision, made alone in an apartment in a city where her reputation had been carefully taken apart, that she was not going to accept the story that had been written about her. Marcus Holloway built an empire on 2 things. One of them was his considerable talent and work ethic, which are real and should be acknowledged. The other was the erasure of the person who helped him begin. And for 5 years, the erasure was held. The narrative held. And the story held. Until a woman in a crimson gown stepped out of a black limousine on a warm Saturday afternoon in Atlanta and placed a manila envelope on a guest book table and walked back out into the sunshine. She did not need to say a word. The document said everything. The truth had always been there. It just needed the right moment to be seen. This is behind the lie. If this story moved you, if it made you think about something in your own life, or reminded you of someone you know, or helped you understand something you had not fully understood before, please share it. Not for the numbers. Because stories like this one deserve to travel further than the people who already know to look for them. There are women right now, in every city in this country, sitting with the quiet knowledge that something was taken from them, wondering if what they have is enough to do anything about it. Maybe hearing this story helps one of them pick up the phone. Maybe it helps one of them find their file folder. That would be more than enough. Thanks for watching. And do not forget to subscribe, because the next story is coming. And it starts somewhere you will not expect.